In the heart of Beverly Hills, nestled among the opulent mansions of Hollywood's golden era, stands a Spanish-style home with a past as vibrant as its former owner Lucille Ball. The comedic legend, whose laughter once echoed through its halls, has long since departed from this world, and yet, whispers persist that she never truly left. In 2023, the house was purchased by a young couple, Ethan and Claire Montgomery. Ethan, a film producer with a penchant for old Hollywood lore, had long admired the home's history. Claire, a real estate agent, was drawn to its architectural beauty but remained skeptical of the ghost stories surrounding it. "It's just a house," she had reassured herself. But from the moment they moved in, odd things began happening. It started with the radio. A vintage unit, left behind in the house, would flicker to life at odd hours, playing songs from the 1950s. At first, they blamed faulty wiring. Then, there were the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to drift through the hallways at night. One evening, Ethan was alone in the den, reviewing footage for a documentary. As he reached for his drink, the television flickered on by itself. The screen glowed white, then faded to static. And then laughter, faint, unmistakable, the echo of Lucille Ball's signature giggle. Claire remained unconvinced until the night she saw the shadow. She had woken up to the sound of rustling, as if someone were sifting through papers in the study. When she stepped into the room, she froze. There, silhouetted against the moonlit window, stood a figure, a woman with short, curled hair. "Lucy," Claire whispered, half mocking herself for even saying it. The shadow turned, and then just like that it was gone. The next day, Claire confided in their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rosenberg, who had lived next door since the 1950s. The old woman nodded knowingly. "Lucy loved this house," she said. "She used to sit in that very study for hours reading fan letters. She always said she'd never leave." Maybe she meant it. Ethan and Claire never felt threatened, only watched. Doors would open on their own. A faint floral perfume would fill the air, and sometimes, if the house was particularly still, they could hear the soft sound of a woman humming. Lucille Ball may have left the stage, but in her beloved Beverly Hills home, it seemed the show wasn't quite over. The house itself seemed alive, breathing softly in the stillness of night, shifting with the weight of a past that refused to settle. The Montgomerys, though modern in their sensibilities, had always believed that old houses carried echoes of those who had loved them most. And Lucille Ball had loved this house. Its Spanish-style exterior, bathed in golden California sunlight by day and cloaked in deep, sprawling shadows by night, had always possessed a warmth, a timelessness that drew people in. The arched doorways framed darkened corridors like the entrance to a forgotten story, waiting to be retold. The walls, thick with age and memory, absorbed the sounds of its new occupants but never relinquished the whispers of its past. Claire had always prided herself on being rational, the kind of woman who sought explanations rather than indulging in the supernatural. But the house challenged her certainty in the quietest, most unsettling ways. There was no grand, terrifying moment of revelation, no slamming doors or shattered mirrors, no shrieks in the night. Instead, there was an ever-growing awareness, an undeniable shift in the air that felt less like fear and more like presence. It was the way the scent of roses, faint, powdery, and unmistakably from another time, would drift through the hallways despite there being no fresh flowers in the house. It was the way Lucy's old dressing mirror, left untouched in an upstairs guest room, would sometimes reflect a movement that wasn't there. A flicker, a shimmer, as if someone had just turned away the moment Claire's eyes met the glass. Ethan, ever the romantic, leaned into the mystery. He found something almost endearing about the idea that Lucille Ball, the woman who had made the world laugh, might still linger in her beloved home. He would leave out a single red carnation in the foyer, her favorite flower, according to Hollywood lore, and sometimes, when he returned, it had shifted ever so slightly, as if unseen fingers had traced its petals. But Claire was beginning to feel watched. Not menacingly, not maliciously, just watched. It was the study that unsettled her most. A beautiful room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a grand oak desk, and a bay window that overlooked the garden. Lucy had spent hours here, reading, writing letters, dreaming up ideas that would become iconic. And now the space refused to be empty. There were nights when Claire would step into the doorway and feel the air change. The weight of something unseen, lingering just beyond her sight. It was the old leather armchair that had belonged to Lucy. No matter how many times they moved it, the Montgomerys would always find it turned slightly toward the window, as if someone had just been sitting there, gazing out at the world beyond. One night, Claire had enough. She was alone in the house, Ethan out at a late-night production meeting, and the air felt thick with expectation. She stood in the doorway of the study, arms crossed, breath steady. "I know you're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A long pause, then a soft creak. The chair rocked ever so slightly, as if something had just lifted its weight from it. The scent of roses grew stronger. The window, latched shut, rattled against a wind that wasn't there. Claire took a slow step back, her pulse a quiet drumbeat against her ribs. And then, for the first time, she heard it. A laugh, low, melodic, familiar. The laughter of a woman who had never truly left. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The laughter was faint at first, no louder than the hush of wind against the glass, but unmistakable in its cadence. It held a musical lilt, a warmth that settled into the air like a lingering note from an old song. Claire felt the sound more than she heard it, a vibration in her bones, a whispering reminder that someone was still here. She exhaled sharply, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and inevitability, as if she had spent the past few months slowly being led to this very moment. The house had been speaking to her in subtle ways, rearranging its own history, nudging her toward acknowledgement. And now, standing at the threshold of the study, she realized she could no longer deny it. Something unseen moved in the corner of her vision, just a flicker, a distortion of the dim light pooling against the bookshelves. Her breath caught in her throat as the old leather chair gave the softest sigh, as though the weight of an invisible body had just been lifted from it. A rush of perfume, roses, powder, something vaguely sweet, like old-fashioned cosmetics, swirled through the room. The smell was richer now, stronger than before. It wasn't drifting through the house as a mere echo of the past. It was here, filling the space, demanding recognition. Claire's fingers gripped the wooden frame of the doorway. She felt the faintest prickle of electricity along her arms, the fine hairs standing on end. She knew fear, but this wasn't it. This was something else, an uncanny awareness. The moment just before a storm breaks. The charged stillness of something watching, waiting. The study's bay window rattled against the quiet night, though the trees outside stood motionless in the calm air. The temperature in the room had dropped just enough for Claire to feel it in her lungs, each breath a little sharper, a little thinner. Then softly, without warning, papers fluttered. A small stack of yellowed letters on the desk, untouched for decades, shifted just slightly as if a breath of air had disturbed them. Claire's eyes locked onto them, drawn in by a force she couldn't name. She hesitated, then stepped forward, the floorboards creaking beneath her. Her fingers brushed against the edges of the topmost envelope, brittle with age, ink faded to a whisper of its former self. The moment she touched it, the radio crackled to life. It wasn't even plugged in. A burst of static filled the room, sharp and sudden, before dissolving into something softer, a melody from another era, warbling and distant. Then, a voice. "Hello, friends." Claire's breath stopped. The voice was warm, familiar, laced with that effortless charm, that unmistakable comedic timing. It was Lucy's voice, not a scream, not a ghostly moan, not some unintelligible whisper from beyond. It was a greeting, casual, playful, almost as if she were stepping onto a television set, preparing to perform. Claire's hands trembled as she stepped back, her pulse pounding against her ribs. The music continued, tinny and faded, as though playing from a long-lost record in another room. A soft knock echoed through the study. Not at the front door, not from outside, from within the house. Claire turned, her breath catching in her throat. Somewhere down the darkened hallway, past the gilded-framed portraits and the winding staircase, something waited. Not in malice, not in menace, but in expectation. The knock echoed through the hushed corridors, a sound so deliberate, so certain, that Claire felt it settle into the marrow of her bones. It wasn't the casual creak of an old house adjusting to the night, nor the unintentional thud of something toppling in another room. It was precise, measured, a gentle rap against wood, as though something was waiting to be acknowledged. Claire's breath slipped from her lips in slow, uneven exhales. The house held its silence in return. The air waited with something thick, something unseen but undeniably there. The scent of roses had deepened now, not just a whisper in the air but a presence all its own, curling around her like the lingering touch of someone who had just left the room. She took a single step back, her heels skimming over the threshold of the study. The wooden floor beneath her feet felt colder now, as though the warmth of the house had retreated, leaving only the sensation of cool, expectant emptiness. Then another knock, softer this time, polite insistence. Claire turned her head slowly toward the hallway. The dim sconces lining the walls flickered ever so slightly, their light pulsing with an almost imperceptible rhythm, as though the house itself had inhaled and was holding its breath. The hallway stretched before her, long and shadowed, lined with dark wood paneling and framed photographs that bore the weight of decades. Some were remnants of the Montgomerys' own collection black and white family portraits, sun-drenched snapshots of vacations, candid moments frozen in time. But interspersed among them, nearly blending into the house itself, were older images, unfamiliar faces, photographs they had never hung themselves. Claire's eyes drifted over them, her pulse slowing into a heavy, deliberate beat. One frame in particular caught her attention, a portrait she had never noticed before, though she had passed this hallway 100 times. It was a simple shot, grainy but clear, of a woman laughing. The angle was slightly blurred, as though caught mid-motion, but the expression was unmistakable. Lucille Ball. Claire's breath hitched. She stepped forward without thinking, drawn in by the way the portrait seemed to hum with something beyond memory. The moment her fingers grazed the edge of the frame, a soft shuffle of movement stirred behind her. She spun, heart hammering. The study was empty. The radio had gone silent. But something had changed. The armchair, the one that had always been turned toward the window, was now facing the desk. As if someone had been sitting there all along, watching her. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat. The house no longer felt merely occupied, it felt aware. Then, as if in response to her realization, the third and final knock came. Not from the hallway, not from the study, but from just beyond the door of the upstairs bedroom. The room where, weeks before, Claire had glimpsed the shadow of a woman standing by the window. The knock was softer now, almost hesitant. Claire's fingers tightened at her sides. She could hear her own heartbeat, the soft hum of blood rushing through her ears. She took a step toward the staircase. Then another. The floor sighed beneath her weight, the house shifting as though adjusting to her movement. The hallway seemed longer now, the shadows stretching, deepening, curling against the walls like ink spilled in water. As she reached the base of the staircase, a whisper of sound slipped through the air. Not a knock, not a creak. A voice, soft, familiar, amused. "Well, are you coming up or not?" Claire's breath caught in her throat. She knew that voice, and for the first time since moving into this house, she felt an answer forming at the back of her mind. Yes. Claire's fingers trembled as they brushed against the wooden banister, the smooth surface worn from decades of touch. The staircase loomed ahead, steep and dark, each step disappearing into the dim glow of the upper hallway. The voice still lingered in the air, as if the walls had absorbed the sound and were now exhaling it back into the house. It had been light, playful, but there had been something else beneath it, a knowing, an expectancy, as though whoever had spoken had been waiting for her to finally listen. The scent of roses was thicker now, wrapping around her like an unseen hand guiding her forward. It wasn't overpowering, not cloying or artificial. It was warm, familiar, laced with something deeper, powder and perfume. a trace of old Hollywood glamour distilled into the very bones of the house. Claire swallowed, her throat tight, and lifted her foot onto the first step. The wood groaned softly beneath her weight. The house responded in kind. Somewhere above, the faintest creak of a shifting floorboard. A breath of air that was not hers. She hesitated. Then, slowly, deliberately, she ascended. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though she were wading through something unseen, something thick and invisible pressing against her limbs. The hallway above stretched forward, lined with doors that had once belonged to another era. The sconces flickered again, a rhythmic pulse of light that sent shadows swaying along the walls. The door at the end of the hall, the bedroom where she had glimpsed the shadow weeks before, stood slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness beyond it. And just as she reached the threshold, something moved. Not a full-bodied figure, not the clear sight of a person standing there, but a flicker, a shifting of air, a change in density, as if the space itself had momentarily warped. Claire's breath stilled in her chest. The door creaked wider. She stepped inside. The room was bathed in silver moonlight, the gauzy curtains billowing slightly despite the windows being shut. The old vanity stood against the far wall, its mirror dulled with age, its surface untouched. The bed was neatly made, the covers smooth, as if no one had slept there in years. And yet, the air was warm, lived in. Claire could feel it, the weight of memory pressing against the walls, the invisible imprint of something that had never truly faded. Then, the mirror shifted. Not the glass itself, not in a way that should have been possible. It was subtle, a trick of light at first, a ripple in the reflection as if the surface were water and something had just moved beneath it. Claire's own reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed, unmoving. But she wasn't alone. There, just behind her, a flicker of red, a hint of movement, a woman's silhouette blurred, indistinct, but undeniably present. Claire's breath hitched. Then, before she could react, before she could turn, the radio crackled to life again. The same voice, warm, light-hearted, a whisper of laughter wrapped around words. "Oh, honey, you should see the look on your face." Claire's pulse slammed against her ribs, and in the mirror, just for a split second, she swore she saw it. Not a shadow, not a ghost, but Lucille Ball herself, smiling. Claire's breath was caught somewhere between a gasp and a laugh because, despite the cold sweat prickling along her spine, despite the rational part of her mind screaming that none of this should be happening, there was something undeniably charming about the apparition in the mirror. Lucille Ball, or whatever remained of her, was grinning. It wasn't a menacing smile, nor a sorrowful one. It was the kind of look a performer gives just before the punchline lands, just before the audience erupts into laughter. Then, in the time it took Claire to blink, the reflection shifted. The warmth faded. The figure softened like a trick of the light, dissolving into nothing. The room was silent again. The mirror showed only Claire, standing there with wide, disbelieving eyes. The weight in the air had lifted, as if the house had just exhaled. Claire turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But the room was empty. Just the furniture, just the moonlight, just the faintest lingering trace of roses. She exhaled. It had been real. It had been her. For a long moment, she simply stood there, waiting to see if anything else would happen. But there were no more knocks, no more voices, no more flickers of movement in the dark corners of the room. And then, just as she began to doubt herself, just as she started to wonder if exhaustion and suggestion had gotten the better of her, a single red carnation rested on the vanity table. Claire hadn't put it there. Her throat tightened. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, not from fear, not from nervousness, but from something else entirely. Affection. It was funny, wasn't it? That even in death, Lucille Ball still had impeccable comedic timing. Claire reached out and picked up the flower, twirling it between her fingers. "Okay," she whispered into the room. "I get it now." A beat of silence. Then, the faintest sound of laughter, just a whisper, just a breath, barely there at all. Claire smiled. And for the first time since moving into this house, she no longer felt like an intruder. She felt like a guest, a very welcome guest. And somewhere, Beyond the veil of the living, Lucille Ball took a bow. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.